If any of you are familiar with the stand-up comedy circuit, you will have heard a particular line a couple of times, which is, "I'm trying out some new material." And that's very much what you're going to get here, I'm afraid. So this is all sort of brand new, and it's a distillation of a number of themes that I cover in my day job, which is, as David alluded, a technology analyst. So as an analyst, I actually do lots of forecasting. That's my job, is to try and predict, what are you going to see with 5G networks, for example. When and how important will they be? Will anyone make any money? But when it comes to futurism, I thought it was really interesting that Rohit just now posited this sort of tussle between the, what he called definitivists and the, well, essentially scenarioists. And what I'm going to talk about today is essentially a third school, which is the definitivisms. And so I'm going to sort of basically take up my normal business role of being a bit of a curmudgeon and give a presentation on what's not going to happen. And you could assert that that is negative, that is sort of destroying some of the sort of nice fluffy optimism around techno-progressivism or futurism generally. But I think there's an important kernel of truth here, which is probably articulated best by a fictional character, which says that you need to eliminate the impossible, and then you're left with the truth, however improbable it may seem. And I think that we do not spend enough time defining, identifying, and then eliminating the impossible. I think we end up spending lots of mental cycles and allocating lots of resources, lots of money, lots of people to pursuing futile ideas. And sometimes they're going to be completely impossible, and I'll talk about some of the ways of identifying them, and sometimes they'll merely be very, very improbable. And I think that I see this a lot in the technology industry in particular, where people sort of hype up massive ideas, whether it's around unrealistic expectations of networks or AI or anything else, where there's a very large dose of wishful thinking. And the same is true in politics and many other walks of society. So I'm going to talk through a couple of sort of almost like a toolkit for trying to get rid of some of the unrealistic ideas and scenarios so that we can spend more time focusing on those which actually have a chance. And I think that I'll cover a number of different sort of ways of looking at this, and I'll try and be a little bit lighthearted as I go through, because I realise this is maybe not dystopian, but it's, I'm probably going to irritate a few people. In fact, if I don't irritate a few people in the room, I'm not doing this properly. So first off, those of you who work in tech are probably familiar with this chart on the left, which is used by a consulting company called Gartner, and it's called the hype cycle. And it basically is the way that a lot of technology evolution occurs, where someone has a good idea, and then there's this massive upsurge of people going, this is going to change the world, everything's going to be obsolete, it's wonderful, we're going to make lots of money on it, and it's going to happen yesterday. And then, for various reasons, that falls off a cliff. And then everyone goes, we screwed that one up, didn't we? And there's a sort of, the complete opposite occurs, where you end up with sort of everyone sort of being really down on an area, and you can identify this time and time again in lots of separate sectors. And then slowly you find that actually it grinds out the productivity, the practicality, all of the little sort of bells and whistles, and all the problems get resolved, and eventually everyone actually takes it up, albeit with less sort of song and dance than people might have thought previously. And that's also called Amara's law, which is that we tend to overestimate importance of things in the short term and underestimate them in the long term. And there's a lot of examples of that, whether it's the internet, whether it's, frankly, electricity, computing, and so on. However, there is a however here, that this picture ignores what happens some of the time. And some of the time what happens is actually that disillusionment was what was right all along, and the whole thing's a dud. And so you end up in some cases where you're actually overestimating the long term as well, and it really is a crap idea. And what I would like to see is more time spent on identifying the things which are going to do this, so that we actually, if you like, flatten out the huge inefficiencies that are inherent in this sort of hype cycle, boom bust, whatever you want to call it. Because what this tends to do, was that the hype is quite good for things like raising funds, it creates unrealistic expectations, and from a policy point of view, quite often, the loudest people that speak to government and other policy people in a policy role are the people who are the hypesters. And quite often you'll find that the noisiest participants, those who can spend the most on lobbyists, those who have the most amazing press articles because they're essentially hyperbole, are not necessarily helping the ultimate outcome. And so I'd quite like us to almost like develop this sort of mental toolkit of recognition of this. Firstly, that you do eventually get to the top, but sometimes you don't. And one of the things I come across quite a bit is wishful thinking ideas that fundamentally won't and can't work. And these are probably the easiest ones to sort of determine to be impossible because you've got fundamental constraints. Speed of light is a good one, or energy densities is another. So I saw a prediction a while back that we would eventually get to a situation of having wireless power as well as wireless communications, which suggested that why do we have wires and sockets in the walls? Why can't we just beam power to everything? And I thought that whoever wrote that hasn't thought that if you're going to have enough energy to cook toast, you really don't want to be standing in the way of the electricity that's going to the toaster, because it's going to have as much energy, and unless it's over a really wide area and it's a massive toaster with an energy collector, you're going to be as brown as the toast at the end. The reason there's a moose here is self-driving vehicles. And I come across this idea of self-driving vehicles all the time, particularly in my industry, the mobile industry. Say, 5G networks will allow self-driving vehicles to be driven from the cloud. You'll have all these autonomous vehicles with sensors and all the rest of it, and you'll have processing in a data center. And I thought, well, there's a problem here. There's two, actually. One is the time to actually get data from the sensor to a computing data center, process it, and then send the instructions back is a finite number of milliseconds, either because of the speed of light to get there, or actually the various delays in the network equipment on the way, buffers and all sorts of other factors. And if you think that at 100 kilometers an hour in a vehicle, and you may well find an autonomous vehicle going much faster, you move about 5 centimeters, 3 centimeters. So you're really in the time that you would take a round trip to a remote data center and get back again, at least. More if there's sort of delays and congestion on the network. And that starts to become a meaningful amount of physical distance before you've actually even begun to think about how you're going to hit the brakes. Worse, the nature of radio propagation means that in remote areas with forests, you probably won't have very good network coverage at all, and you'll have coverage gaps. And that's just a function of radio propagation. The sort of higher speeds that 5G is supposed to deliver get probably absorbed by, they'll be running into frequencies that get absorbed by trees and leaves and foliage. So when it comes down to it, I don't want my self-driving vehicle to be dependent on a 5G network in the cloud. I want the supercomputer in the vehicle itself next to the sensors. I want the distances involved and the times involved to be microseconds, not milliseconds or seconds. So you can look at that, and you can look at the assertions and say, well, that's just prohibited via physics. Someone asked before about Bitcoin and blockchain. I'm doing quite a lot of work on that at the moment. And one of the problems there is around the computation and the cryptology involved in calculating a trustworthy decentralized system. And I'll come on to that in a second. In fact, that is what I call like a show-stopping detail, where you have a really good idea and it's something could be technical, it could be commercial, that makes it hard to come true. And unless you actually drill into a problem, you don't always see it. So here you have plastic wrap, an engine component, and a chip. And all of these are things which would be extremely hard to ever 3D print. So when you hear people saying, we'll be 3D printing everything, we'll just have something in your kitchen and you'll press the button and you'll get a new iPhone. It is nonsense. And the reason is that all of these need very large pieces of equipment to make them able to do what they do. So you need to do ion implantation for surface treatment on various, maybe that's a royalty-free image, but a Formula One engine, for example. Often the surfaces require several $1 million worth of ion implantation accelerator. Electron beams are used to create plastic film. The average semiconductor plant these days, and if you're building a new chip plant, you will be needing about $5 billion and 100,000 square meters. And that number is getting bigger with each generation of chips. You're not going to be doing it in your house. And so you've got these sort of annoying, but unfortunately critically important details which scupper what some people's visions and scenarios of the future are. Bitcoin, someone asked about before. There's lots of different blockchain currencies and technologies, but the main Bitcoin blockchain has a fundamental problem if you want it to be the basis of an economy, which is how many transactions it can do. I don't know, people here, does anyone want to have a guess? The Bitcoin blockchain, how many transactions a second can it do globally? 7, yes. A grand total of 7. That is quite a lot of zeros away from what we would need if we were going to fundamentally change the financial system. And some of the newer Bitcoin and blockchain evolutions have improved that, but we still need a few more zeros yet. Then we've got the next 2 slides are two similar problems where you can position an idea as a utopia or a great destination. But there's a joke where someone asked, a traveller asked a farmer, how do I get to the city? And it's like, well, to be honest, I wouldn't start from here. And that is a big problem, is that you can have this utopia as a vision, but if you have to get there through a catastrophic dystopia on the way, then that's really not ideal. So we could say, for example, wouldn't it be nice to have a world where we don't think about nationalities and religions and differences? And we could all agree, yes. But I would challenge people in this room to come up with a way of getting rid of all religions and differences and opinions about them without going through some fairly horrible wars in the middle. And the same thing with nationalities. And it's that type of thing of, it's all very well putting a utopian vision up, but if you get there via economic collapse, war, and various other undesirable intermediate points, a bit like as Rohit was saying just now, then we probably don't need to give too many mental cycles to the unattainable end goal. Linked to this, but not quite the same, is inertia of what we have today. So if you think the point I just made was talking about ideas which are actually unattainable because the midway point is so undesirable. There's others where you can see the midway points, but they're all messy hybrids. You will have a bit of what we have historically and the new thing, and over a period of years or decades, you have the mix goes towards the new thing and away from the old thing. So it could be replacing vehicles with self-driving ones. You're going to have this probably decades-long transition period. See this in networks. Everyone talks about 5G networks, mobile networks are going to be wonderful. Yes, but there's going to be a decade where you have 5G here, 4G here, and frankly 2G or no G in your basement. And so any application or service that is intended to do this will have to live in this messy, heterogeneous world. And so unless you've designed your scenario, your end goal, to be able to compete, to cope with those hybrids transitions, again, it's not really worth it. Orthogonal and adjacent trends. We're very used to saying things like, all other things being equal, ... They won't be equal. The one thing we can be absolutely certain of is an awful lot of things will not be equal. There will be climate change, there will be better AI, there will be more people, there will be a whole bunch of things which we can be absolutely certain of, and then there's another bunch of things which are quite probable as well in terms of the way that data about us and surveillance changes, for example. So climate change is a good one, where you probably don't think about climate change in terms of, say, electric vehicles, apart from the idea that actually it's good because we stop pumping out hydrocarbons. I am curious, though, whether there's other interdependencies. So when the floodwaters recede from Texas over the next weeks and months, I'd be really curious to see what gets up and running first, whether it is petrol distribution or whether it is the electric grid and essentially replacement for cars and vehicles that batteries have been ruined on. And I suspect it's going to be the old stuff. And we've had essentially things like climate change, which is going on and is going to impact our way of solving all the other problems we've talked about in unpredictable ways. And there will be a whole set of, and that's not particularly a criticism of anything, but it's just saying there will be these orthogonal things that are going on with society and technology and longevity. Longevity is a good one. We talk about taxation later, but we have to think about the implications of greater longevity on the pension industry. So whatever we're doing, we can't just say, the pensions world will look as it is today, because you'll have people who live to 120. So your underlying assumptions will change, irrespective of whether you've got a good solution to today's problem. You actually need to be thinking about how the goalposts are moving and what tomorrow's problems will be. I'm running out of time, but there's a whole bunch of these other sort of constraining factors that I don't think enough time is spent on. I mean, law and human nature are the two obvious ones here, but there's also competitive responses, or not just competitive, but I suppose bad actor responses to a lot of these shifts. So all of the ideas of, we can do voting on a mobile phone, or we can use new forms of democracy, every single one of those is going to be gamed by someone you wish they weren't doing it. And you're seeing this with social networks at the moment, for example. So you have to always think about what are the responses to the responses. What are the possible scenarios? And you're never going to get everything, but you at least need to wargame these and come up with okay, if I was trying to turn this promised utopia into a dystopia, what would I do? By the time you've sort of covered 10 of those, you're at least confident that you've got the capability to respond if and when you can. So, to sum up, don't always be afraid of negativity. Sometimes a bit of applied cynicism, being a curmudgeon, saying, that's a great idea apart from these 17 things. Sometimes there's value in doing that. It will hopefully allow focus on the realistic, to identify wishful thinking, and to eliminate the real impossibilities. Thank you.
Many thanks, Dean. Got a whole bunch of questions here. We'll take some from the floor as well.
Good stuff.
So, on cryptocurrencies, are you taking them off the table, or are you keeping an open mind to them?
Well, I think cryptocurrencies are really interesting. I think there's a big debate as to whether they are stores of value or ways of doing transactions. And I think one of the things that's happened over the last 6 months is, as well as sort of Bitcoin and Ethereum as essentially value stores, we're seeing this massive increase in tokenization of all sorts of other, in theory, fungible forms of value. So I'm advising a company that's trying to turn internet access and mesh networking into a tokenizable product. And to be honest, it's early days. I don't think you can point to any existing token-based system of exchange and say, that is the case study, that's the one that's proven it really works. Come back in a year or two, I think, for that answer. But I think there's awfully a lot of hype, but equally there's going to be something that falls out at the end of this, but there's probably a few people get fingers burned with investments, bad investments.
Any thoughts on quantum computing as another possible controversial topic?
Quantum computing is a really interesting one, partly because it's probably the sort of thing you could use to determine what is possible and impossible in and of itself. I am moderately bullish on quantum computing. I am not enough of an expert to give a prediction on timing. What I hear from people in the general purpose quantum computing is maybe a 10-year horizon thing, but it's possible that it may be accelerated or slowed down. So I think that is one where I certainly wouldn't take it off the table.
And on the topic of crossovers between different trends, is there a crossover or an implication between quantum computing and blockchain, in that the quantum computing is going to invalidate all the assumptions about cryptography and so on?
No. I think that there has been a lot of work done over the last 5 to 10 years in what are being called quantum safe encryption algorithms. So I think, bearing in mind that it's mathematicians involved in both, I think you can be fairly safe to believe that the types of people who invent cryptographic algorithms are, well, if not the exact same people looking at quantum algorithms, they're not that far from it. And I think it's one of those nice, hard problems to solve that people like to try and solve.
I'll ask you to make a forecast.
Good.
Do you think we're going to keep on experiencing the trough of disillusionment? And you've basically given your whole talk saying, the trough of disillusionment, we ought to be able to avoid it if we're smarter. Is it going to persist? Are we going to keep on being misled by it?
There will always be people who try to oversell ideas. I think the question is whether we are smart enough to listen to. And I think there's possibly whoever creates an AI which is essentially the bullshit detector, I think will be of great value to humanity.
All right, so then we might have the AI itself saying this one is headed for the trough of disillusionment, so let's not go there. That would be interesting. You talked about inertia as being a force of things going slower and slower.
Yeah.
Is there ever a case when that inertia and these human factors will actually make positive change run faster? Is it always that we hanker back to older and worse solutions, or might we collectively think, this is a good solution, then our human tendencies push it better?
Possibly. It rather depends on the nature of that, the nature of the inertia. I mean, there are certain things where you have trillions of dollars of sunk cost, where you have people who, frankly, can't or won't be changed unless over a period of decades or until there's a generational change. So there's certain things which are pretty locked in. There are other things which do change much more rapidly. In politics is the most obvious one, where what you might think of as being unthinkable changes. Macron in France, party from nowhere becomes president of the year, would be considered to be an example of inertia that wasn't expected and that accelerated.
Might something like that happen in the UK?
So, it's possible. I would say that the current first past the post system mitigates against the probability of it. The French political system is set up slightly differently, but equally, there's various people who talk about formulation of new political parties that could hold balance of power and potentially take seats, but most psephologists are doubtful of that.
Any questions from the floor? Well, yeah, and then I'll come back to you.
To pick up on your theme of being negative and trying to use it as a force for positive predictions, I would like to sort of pick your brains on the idea of ideologies, religion, for example, as being potentially a force that can put a real block on these future scenarios. Because I was very intrigued, and actually I had some thoughts about it as well, when Rohit was talking about Hindu religion being potentially incompatible with transhumanism. Well, in a sense, you could argue every religion that sort of preaches heaven and some kind of resurrection or sort of soul transposition is incompatible with transhumanism. So can potentially big religious movements taking over politics, in your view, put a stop to positive sort of techno-progressive view of the future?
In some places around the world, they will certainly try. And I suspect you will probably find a differential depending on where you are in the world as to sort of how fast some of the ideas that get talked about get uptaken. On the other hand, you may find that there are certain aspects of techno-progressivism that are adopted faster, and things which are sort of maybe less controversial to do with perhaps healthcare or education or something like that. But in terms of the sort of life extension, I think that's probably going to be the case, unless someone has an offshoot of a religion that embraces that and sort of comes up with a persuasive and followable idea without being denounced as a heretic. But I have to say, it's outside my normal area of making forecasts.
Yes, you mentioned about pensions and ageing population. I remember in the early years of when Star Trek was on, they had these things that look like mobile phones now, and it sort of came to pass, pretty quickly, really, when you look back on it. I think also Scotty had something he passed over people to diagnose whether they were ill or not, and with a separate one to fix it. Are you broadly optimistic or pessimistic about whether medicine can provide solutions that address the problems of demographics and ageing populations?
Some of them, yes. And clearly there's a huge amount of work that's going into everything from replacement organs, the diagnostics, the genetic aspects of it. Can we fix everything? Well, certainly on David's stages before, we've had Aubrey de Grey and others, and I have to say that some of that starts to fade into the sort of wishful thinking end of things. But equally, I can buy into the sort of the staged and transition period. So we certainly are likely to be able to deal with more sorts of cancer, or we already have done with a lot of infectious diseases. And so aspects of relating to aging, I think progressive, and David has written a book on this, so probably can answer that more fully than I can.
Dean Bubley, anti-forecaster, disruptive analyst, thank you very much.
Thanks, David.